My ex-husband filed for full custody of our kids, claiming I was an absent parent. In court, his lawyer said, "She's never around." I quietly presented school records, doctor visit logs, and family photos showing I had been present every day. His lawyer went silent as the judge reprimanded him. I never thought I'd be sitting in a courtroom fighting for my right to be a mother. I never thought the man I once loved, the man I married, would try to paint me as some kind of deadbeat parent. But that's exactly what happened. It all started when my ex-husband, Dan, not his real name, decided he wanted full custody of our kids. Out of nowhere, I got a notice in the mail. He was taking me to court. The reason? Apparently, I was an absent parent. I almost laughed when I read it. Me? Absent? I worked from home. I did school drop-offs and pickups, packed lunches, helped with homework, made every doctor's appointment. I was always there. Dan, on the other hand, saw the kids twice a month, when he didn't cancel. Something wasn't adding up. I had my suspicions about why he was doing this. He had just gotten engaged to Sarah, the woman he cheated on me with. Maybe she wanted to play perfect stepmom. Maybe Dan wanted to stop paying child support. Maybe he just wanted to win. I wasn't going to let that happen. Dan and I were married for nearly 10 years. In the beginning, he was charming. Funny. Attentive. We had 2 kids together, and for a while, I thought we were happy. But over time, he became distant. He started working late, a lot. Spending weekends away on business trips. Always glued to his phone. I tried to be understanding. I wanted to believe him. Until one night, when his phone lit up while he was asleep. I glanced at the screen. It was a message from someone named Sarah. I opened it. And just like that, my whole world collapsed. Explicit messages. A hotel receipt. A vacation photo of the 2 of them, while he was supposedly on a work trip. I remember sitting there in shock, reading message after message. This wasn't just some mistake. This wasn't a one-time thing. He had built an entire second life. The next morning, I confronted him. He denied it at first. Said it was just emotional. Then, when I showed him the proof, he switched to blaming me. Said I was too busy with the kids. Said I stopped being fun. I filed for divorce the same day. The custody agreement was simple, 50-50 on paper, but in reality, I had the kids almost all the time. Dan would cancel last minute, say he was too busy. When he did take them, he'd drop them off at his parents' house or let them sit in front of the TV all weekend. And then, one day, the court papers arrived. I walked into that courtroom thinking it would be a simple case. The facts were on my side. I had always been the primary parent. I never imagined Dan would have the audacity to lie so boldly. But he did. His lawyer stood up and painted me as some kind of absentee mother. Said I was too focused on my career. Said I neglected the kids. Claimed Dan had been the one raising them. I sat there, stunned. Dan just sat back, smug, acting like he had already won. His lawyer kept going. Said my kids needed stability and that Dan could provide a better home environment. He even pulled out pictures, photos of Dan and the kids at the park, at birthday parties. I almost laughed. I knew exactly what those pictures were. They were the 3 times in the past year Dan had actually done something with the kids, just so he could post them on social media. They didn't show the times he forgot their birthdays. The times he canceled weekend visits last minute. The times he no-showed at school events. Then it was my turn. I didn't just tell the court the truth, I proved it. I handed the judge a binder. A thick, organized binder. Inside were school records showing I had attended every meeting, every parent-teacher conference, every event. Doctor visit logs proving I had taken them to every appointment, while Dan hadn't shown up once. Screenshots of texts and emails from Dan, canceling visitations, making excuses, saying he was too busy. Sworn statements from my kids' teachers, pediatrician, and even our neighbors, every single one confirming I was the primary parent. And then the photos. Hundreds of photos. Me at every soccer game. Every birthday. Every holiday. Photos of me taking the kids to the zoo, helping with homework, making pancakes on Sunday mornings. I could see Dan shifting in his seat. His smirk was gone. His lawyer flipped through the binder, silent. The judge looked through the evidence, then turned to Dan. His voice was sharp. This is quite a different story than the one you presented. Dan didn't say a word. Then, the judge started tearing into him. He called the case a waste of the court's time. Said Dan had knowingly lied to manipulate the system. Said he had tried to weaponize the legal system against me. And then, the final blow, not only was his motion for full custody denied, but the judge actually reduced his visitation rights. Dan's face turned red. His lawyer was whispering frantically to him. Sarah looked miserable. And I just sat there, calm. Because I knew. I had won. But it wasn't over yet. After the ruling, Dan stormed out of the courtroom. I thought that would be the last of it. That he'd accept the decision and move on. I was wrong. Because Dan wasn't done yet. And the next move he made? That was the one that would ruin him. After the judge ruled against him, I thought that was it. Case closed. Dan had lost. He'd sulk, maybe rant about it to his buddies, but he'd have no choice but to accept the reality he created for himself. But I underestimated him. Dan wasn't the kind of man to take a loss and move on. He needed to win, even if it meant setting everything on fire. The first sign that something was wrong came 2 days later. I was getting the kids ready for school when my phone buzzed, an email from the school principal. Subject, concerning attendance issues. I frowned and opened it. Dear Ms., last name, we received a report that your children have been consistently late or absent from school. Given the importance of attendance, we would like to discuss this matter immediately. Please let us know when you are available. What? That made no sense. My kids were never late. I personally drove them to school every morning. I clicked open their attendance records, and sure enough, someone had reported 10 unexcused absences in the past 2 months. I knew exactly who was behind it. Dan. I emailed the school back right away, attaching screenshots of my Google Maps history, solid proof that I had driven my kids to school every single day. I also sent photos from their teachers showing them in class on the so-called absent days. Less than an hour later, the principal called me. She apologized. Said there had been a misunderstanding. Someone had made anonymous reports about my neglect, and as protocol, they had to investigate. I clenched my jaw. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was Dan trying to paint me as a bad mother again. Fine. If he wanted to play dirty, I'd be ready. For a while, nothing else happened. Dan stopped showing up for his scheduled visitation weekends, and honestly, that was a relief. The kids stopped asking about him, and I finally felt like I could breathe. Until one evening when I noticed a car parked outside my house. It was a white sedan, tinted windows, just sitting there with the engine running. I peeked through the curtains. The car didn't move. At first, I thought maybe it was a lost Uber driver or a neighbor's guest waiting for someone. But after 3 nights of the same car showing up at the same time, parking in the same spot, I knew something was off. I took out my phone, zoomed in, and snapped a picture of the license plate. The next day, I had my friend's husband, who worked for the DMV, run the plate. He texted me back almost immediately. Registered owner, Sarah, last name. Sarah. Dan's fiancée. I stared at the name on my screen, my heart pounding. Why was she parked outside my house? I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe she was just trying to catch Dan cheating on her, though, honestly, I wouldn't put it past him. Maybe she was just being nosy. Or maybe, and this was the thought that chilled me, Dan had put her up to something. I wasn't going to wait to find out. I called the police. An officer came by that evening and took my report. But because Sarah hadn't done anything illegal, she was just sitting in her car, they couldn't do much. The officer suggested I get security cameras and call them again if she approached my house. So that's exactly what I did. I installed 3 cameras, one above my front door, one facing the driveway, and one covering the street. And then I waited. And just like clockwork, at 8:47 p.m., the white sedan showed up again. But this time, Sarah didn't stay inside the car. This time, she got out. The motion-activated floodlights flashed on, bathing her in bright white light. Sarah froze, her hand halfway to my mailbox. Then, without even grabbing anything, she bolted back to her car and sped off. I ran outside and opened my mailbox. Inside was a manila envelope. No return address. No name. Just my address scrawled in black marker. My hands shook as I ripped it open. Inside were printed screenshots of my old Facebook photos, photos of me at parties from college. Me holding a red Solo cup. Me dancing. Me laughing with friends. And then, stapled to the stack, was a typed letter. To whom it may concern, I am writing to bring attention to a serious issue regarding Ms. my last name. While she appears to be a responsible parent, there is overwhelming evidence that she has a history of alcohol abuse and reckless behavior. Attached, you will find photos of MS. Last name, engaging in excessive drinking and inappropriate conduct. These actions raise serious concerns about the safety of her children. I urge you to consider whether such an individual is truly fit to be a mother. No signature. No sender. But I didn't need one. I knew who it was from. Dan. Or maybe Sarah, acting on his behalf. I laughed out loud. Actually laughed. They were this desperate? These pictures were over 10 years old. I had been 22 in those photos. Before marriage, before kids. And the best they could find was me at a house party holding a drink? Pathetic. I called my lawyer first. Then I called the police. The officer came back the next day, looked at the footage, and nodded. Harassment. If she comes back again, we'll charge her with stalking. I hoped that would be the end of it. I hoped Dan would get the message. But it wasn't over. Because the next week, CPS showed up at my door. When I saw the two women standing outside my house, clipboards in hand, my stomach dropped. Ms., my last name, the taller one asked, flashing a badge. We're from Child Protective Services. We received a report about potential child neglect in your home. We'd like to ask you a few questions. I swear, for a second, I almost blacked out. Dan had actually done it. It wasn't enough that he lost in court. It wasn't enough that Sarah had been stalking me. Now, he was trying to weaponize CPS against me. I took a deep breath and forced myself to stay calm. Of course, I said, stepping aside to let them in. They glanced around as they walked through the house. It was clean. Tidy. The kids were at school, so there was no chaos, just their backpacks near the door, their drawings on the fridge, and the faint smell of cookies from the batch I'd baked the night before. We sat at the kitchen table. The shorter woman flipped through her notes. We received a report stating that your children are frequently left unsupervised, she began. That they'd been seen wandering the neighborhood alone. I blinked. That's a lie. She looked up. You're saying there's no truth to the report? None. The other woman leaned forward. We also have concerns about potential alcohol abuse. I almost laughed. So this was it. This was the big plan. They thought some old college party photos and a fake complaint would be enough to take my kids away. I pushed back my chair, stood up, and went straight to the kitchen counter. Would you like some coffee? I asked. Tea? They exchanged glances. No, thank you. Then let me show you something. I pulled out my CPS file binder. I had prepared it years ago, just in case. Inside were my children's medical records, school reports, a list of every pediatrician visit, and a calendar tracking their schedules. I placed it in front of them. You can check with the school. My kids have never missed a day. And as for the neglect, I work from home. They're never alone. The women flipped through the pages. One of them nodded slightly. Can I also show you something else? I said. I walked them over to the security monitor in my living room. I rewound the footage to the night Sarah had left the envelope in my mailbox. I pressed play. There she was, clear as day. The floodlights flashed on, her face in full view. The moment she realized she was caught. That's Dan's fiancée, I said, keeping my voice even. She's been watching my house for weeks. And she's the one who left these. I pulled out the fake letter and the printed out college photos. These are from over a decade ago. The CPS worker's eyebrows shot up. I didn't stop there. I pulled up the email from the school principal about the false attendance complaints. Then I opened my phone and showed them texts from Dan, texts of him canceling visitations, showing zero involvement in our kids' lives. I watched as the women exchanged another glance. Well, the taller one finally said, clearing her throat. We're definitely seeing some inconsistencies. That's one way to put it, I said. The visit lasted another 15 minutes, but by the end, they were apologizing to me. They assured me they'd close the case immediately and note the false reports in the system. As soon as they left, I locked the door, exhaled, and let the rage sink in. Dan thought he could weaponize the system against me? Fine. Two could play that game. The first thing I did was call my lawyer. We're filing a restraining order against Sarah, I said. He agreed immediately. We had the security footage. The police report. And now, a false CPS report tied to Dan and Sarah's harassment. That was more than enough. The second thing I did? I called Dan. I never called him unless it was about the kids, but this time, I made an exception. He picked up on the second ring. What do you want? Cut the crap, Dan. My voice was cold. I know it was you. Silence. Then a fake laugh. I have no idea what you're talking about. I wasn't playing games. Sarah's been caught on my security cameras, stalking my house. The fake CPS report? They know it was false. This is your last chance to back off before I drag you and your fiancé into court for harassment. More silence. Then, a low, annoyed exhale. I didn't tell her to do anything. I scoffed. Right. So she's just randomly obsessed with me? Sitting outside my house, calling CPS, leaving fake evidence? That's your story? You're being dramatic, he muttered. You always overreact, I hung up mid-sentence. He wasn't going to admit anything. But it didn't matter. Because now? I had the upper hand. 2 days later, Sarah was served. I don't know if she thought I was bluffing, but she found out real quick that I wasn't. The restraining order hearing was brutal. My lawyer laid out everything, the security footage showing her at my house. The false CPS report and how it backfired. The stalking pattern. The same car, parked outside at the same time, night after night. Sarah tried to claim she was just checking on the kids. That she was concerned. My lawyer didn't let her finish. So you were concerned enough to leave an anonymous report, but not enough to knock on the door and actually check on them? She stammered. Fumbled. Looked to Dan, who sat at the back of the courtroom. He didn't say a word. In the end, the judge granted the restraining order. Sarah couldn't come near me, my house, or my kids. And Dan? Oh, he wasn't off the hook. Because while Sarah was getting slapped with a restraining order, I was preparing something else, a modification to our custody agreement. I wasn't just going to defend myself anymore. I was going to end this war. After the restraining order was granted against Sarah, I expected Dan to rage. Maybe send me a long-winded email or a pathetic text trying to shift the blame. Maybe he'd even try to apologize, just to save face. But he went silent. And that silence? It was worse. Because I knew Dan. When he wasn't talking, he was plotting. I wasn't wrong. A week after Sarah was legally banned from being near me and the kids, I got another email from my lawyer. Subject, motion for emergency custody hearing Dan had filed again. This time, he wasn't claiming I was an absent parent. That excuse was dead. Instead, he had changed his strategy. Now, he was arguing that I was mentally unfit to parent. The claim? That I had anger issues. That I was emotionally unstable. That my paranoia about being stalked and harassed made me dangerous to our children. And the best part? He was using my own restraining order against Sarah as evidence. I swear, I sat there staring at the email for a full minute, trying to process the insanity of it. Dan had twisted my own protection order into a weapon against me. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From rage. This was it. This was his final move. He had thrown everything at me. Lies, manipulation, legal harassment, and this was his last shot. Fine. If he wanted to go down swinging, I'd make sure he was the one who hit the ground first. The courtroom was packed. Even though family court cases don't usually have an audience, Dan had brought his parents, his sister, even a few of his work buddies. Sarah, of course, was not there. I wasn't alone, either. My best friend sat behind me, along with my parents. The hearing started, and Dan's lawyer went all in. They claimed I had a history of paranoia, that my restraining order was excessive, that my behavior proved I was too emotionally reactive to provide a stable environment for the children. Dan sat there, acting concerned. Like he was just so worried about his kids. I didn't react. I just watched. Then it was my turn. And I didn't hold back. I stood up, walked to the witness stand, and burned his entire argument to the ground. First, I reminded the court why I had a restraining order, because Dan's fiancée had been stalking me, leaving fake CPS reports, and trying to manipulate the system. Then, I pulled out a file. A very special file. Inside were recordings. See, I had made a decision a few weeks ago. I knew Dan would keep pushing, and I knew he was arrogant enough to slip up. So the last time he called me, I recorded it. I hit play. And the entire courtroom heard Dan admit that Sarah had been behind the stalking. That he had let her do it. That he didn't stop her because he thought it would work in his favor. Dan's face turned a sick shade of gray. His lawyer scrambled, objecting, demanding that the recording be dismissed. The judge denied the objection. It was admissible. And it only got worse from there. I handed over phone records. Proof that Dan and Sarah had communicated right before the fake CPS report was filed. Then came the final blow. A testimony from our children's school counselor. She stated, under oath, that Dan had been completely uninvolved in his kids' lives. That he had missed every school event, every teacher meeting, every milestone. That the kids barely even talked about him anymore. The judge turned to Dan. His voice was ice cold. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Dan opened his mouth, then closed it. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but it didn't matter. Because he knew. He had lost. After a tense moment of silence, the judge gave his ruling. Dan's motion for full custody? Denied. But that wasn't all. Because after everything I presented, the judge went one step further. Dan's visitation rights? Reduced even more. And then came the final nail in the coffin. He was ordered to pay all of my legal fees. I saw the moment it hit him. The realization that he had not only lost, but destroyed himself in the process. His face went pale. His hands clenched. And for the first time in all of this? Dan looked scared. Dan stormed out of the courtroom before the judge even finished. His family followed, whispering furiously to him. His mother looked devastated. His father just shook his head. I walked out with my head high. As I reached the hallway, I heard footsteps behind me. Dan's sister. I braced myself, expecting some kind of attack. Instead, she sighed. I told him to drop this, she muttered. I told him he was being stupid. But he doesn't listen. I stared at her. Then, in a low voice, she said, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. I know you're a good mom. And then she walked away. In the months that followed, Dan fell apart. Sarah left him. I don't know when or why, but she packed up and moved back home. Dan started missing visitation weekends more and more. The kids stopped asking about him. Eventually, he moved out of state for a fresh start. He called me once, drunk and bitter, blaming me for everything. I hung up. That was the last time I ever heard his voice. I won. Not just in court. Not just legally. I won because my kids are happy. I won because they have a safe, stable home. I won because I fought for them, and I never let Dan's manipulation break me. I used to wonder if Dan ever felt guilty. If he ever regretted what he did. But now? I don't care. He made his choices. And now, he has to live with them. As for me, I'm at peace. Because when it mattered most, I stood my ground. And I'll never regret that.